And I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining. And of course, as we have in the past, we're looking forward to another large audience. Some of you know that we've been offering these monthly lectures, and we've been doing them not only to meet our educational mandate, or frankly, to keep our members engaged since we were unable to hold our in-person seminar last year because of the virus, but additionally to share with other ceramic organizations and their members the prolific output of the Wedgwood Company since 1759. Beyond the diverse types of Wedgwood's production, we have offered lectures about the specific artists such as Claire Leighton and the Lesueur and the Pole families. We've talked about how Wedgwood marketed their products beyond England and how materials were sourced. In the next few weeks, members will be receiving an email with a link to an evaluation questionnaire. And I hope that you'll take the time to complete it and to return it. The conclusions gleaned from the data will help us to determine the possibility of another lecture series on Zoom, as well as some topics for potential future talks. I'd like to remind you that the lecture will be recorded, and this lecture will join the others on our YouTube channel. The easiest way for you to access them is to simply go to YouTube and search Wedgwood International Seminar. The Wedgwood International Seminar was founded in Philadelphia in 1956, 65 years ago. And during this unprecedented year, it has been our pleasure to sponsor these lectures free of charge. So for any of you who are not yet members, why not consider joining the WIS? Because in addition to these Zoom lectures, other benefits include our annual 4-day in-person seminar, the scholarly proceedings, which are edited by Dr. Ann Forschler-Tarish, and of course, the Fellowship of Ceramic Enthusiasts from around the world. It's easy to access a WIS membership form. Simply go to our website, which is wedgwoodinternationalseminar.org, and you will find a link to a membership form. So a few quick words on how we're going to conduct the meeting today. Dr. Ann Forschler-Tarish will be today's moderator. She will introduce our speaker. The lecture will be followed by time for a question and answer session. So please remember to type any questions or comments into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. After the Q&A session, if you don't mind, hang around because I'd like to take another minute or two for some reminders. So now I'd like to turn this meeting over to Ann. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening in some cases. I'm very pleased to provide a brief introduction for Catrin Jones. Catrin Jones is Chief Curator of the V&A Wedgwood Collection at Barlaston. She's newish in this position, but she's certainly not new to ceramics. She's got an extensive background in the field. She joined the V&A from the Wilberforce Museum in Bath, where she was Curator of Applied Arts, and she's held curatorial posts at the Ashmolean Museum, the Museum of the Home and Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where she got her original training as an assistant curator. She read the history of art at Oxford and completed her master's at the Courtauld. And she's currently working on an MBA in leadership, so she's quite busy at the moment. She's published widely in contemporary and European ceramics, and she is a Wedgwood scholar in the field as well. She currently sits on the committee of the Islamic Art and Material Cultural Subject Specialist Network and the Contemporary Ceramics SSN Steering Group. She's also a trustee of the Clay Foundation, which is the charity behind the British Ceramics Biennale. So welcome, Katrin. We're very excited that you're presenting this lecture today. Everyone, please, as a reminder, ask some questions through the chat and we'll address those at the end of the lecture. So welcome, Katrin.
Thank you so much, Anne, for a lovely introduction, and to the Wedgwood International Seminar for inviting me to speak to you today. It's evening in the UK, but good afternoon to you all. Just bear with me while I load up my slides, and we'll kick things off. So I wanted to start with a thank you to the Wedgwood International Seminar, to Lorraine, David and the team for everything you've done to make the experience behind the scenes so seamless. And it's been a real pleasure during the lecture series so far to hear about such different aspects of the Wedgwood story, and also to hear from some of those connected to the V&A Wedgwood Collection. Our archivist, Lucy Led, Collections and Curatorial Services Officer and future PhD candidate Rebecca Klarner, and of course Gay Blake Roberts, whose legacy and impact on Wedgwood studies has been so significant. But as a relative newcomer to the specific field of Wedgwood myself, and as we've all been separated by COVID in this strangest of years, I've not had the opportunity to meet with many of you myself. So I thought I'd start by giving a little background. I arrived in early 2020 in Wedgwood, and so I just had a few weeks in my new role of Chief Curator before the world went into lockdown. You'll all, I'm sure, be aware that following a challenging few years for Wedgwood, it was thanks to the generosity of many supporters like yourselves during a campaign led by Art Fund that the Wedgwood Collection was gifted to the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2014 and remains in its home in Barlaston, just outside Stoke-on-Trent, on long-term loan. The collections are housed in the award-winning museum, which opened in 2008 to great acclaim. It's part of the World of Wedgwood visitor attraction, which also features the Wedgwood factory tour. I am lucky enough in my position to manage the wonderful museum you see on screen and its collections, based in Staffordshire, both as a part of the V&A's ceramics department and working in partnership with Fiskars, the Finnish consumer goods company, which now owns Wedgwood. So at the end of my talk this evening, I'm going to briefly outline some of our plans for the V&A Wedgwood Collection and hopefully encourage you all to visit once again when international travel becomes possible again. And perhaps we might once again host the WIS in Barlaston when we're able to do so. It's been a real pleasure to immerse myself in the world of Wedgwood over the past year, despite the distance between myself and the collections that working mostly from home during the pandemic has brought. But I've worked as a curator, as Anne said, mainly in the field of ceramics for over a decade. I became interested in the medium when I first started out as an intern at Waddesdon Manor and discovered a love of Sèvres porcelain. I went on to write my master's dissertation on the influence of textiles on European, on the designers and patrons of the French Royal Manufactory. My next project was the European Ceramics Galleries at the Ashmolean Museum during their 2008-9 redevelopment. So I worked on the redisplay of the Henry Rissick Marshall collection of Worcester porcelain. My first experience of working with Wedgwood specifically came when I curated a show at the V&A in 2013 called Deception, Ceramics and Imitation. This exhibition explored the extraordinary potential of ceramics as a medium for replicating nature, both in the form of surface decorations, imitating hard stones, minerals and metals, but also in the playful imitation of the natural world, and starting, of course, with Wedgwood's fantastic cauliflower teapots. I was curator of the Holborn Museum in Bath, the collection of the 19th century Baronet Sir William Holborn, seen here on the left, a collector of silver, Renaissance bronzes and pictures. And I became very interested in the ceramics that Holborn had inherited from his parents, including an armorial service from China and a collection of vases and jasper plaques, almost certainly acquired from the Wedgwood shop in Milson Street in Bath. Here you can see an old glass plate image of the original Holborn Museum displays, And I'm just circling the collection of Wedgwood material. I appreciate it's not the easiest thing to see, but of course recommend a visit when you're able to do so. And these displays also include a very interesting Prometheus vase of 1769 made at Humphrey Palmer's factory, modelled by the infamous Jean Voyer, who was of course imprisoned after stealing from Wedgwood. At the Holborn, I curated exhibitions from Silver, Light and Shade, which featured masterpieces of historic and contemporary silver, to exhibitions on contemporary tapestry and many other areas. I also led the museum's contemporary programme, collaborating with artists from Paul Scott to Nicholas Rena and Michael Eden, known for his playful reimaginings of historic vases using 3D printed techniques. I commissioned Michael to create a new range inspired by members of the Lunar Society. And on the left, you can see a photograph of the installation of that exhibition, including pieces inspired by mathematical patterns, the Nautilus shell, and a vase inspired by James Watt. And on the right, a piece called Soho, which explores some of Matthew Bolton's innovations. There turned out to be a surprising Wedgwood connection in my final exhibition at the Holborn as well. Grace and Perry, the pre-therapy years. For this project, we reached out to private collectors to uncover the early works of Grace and Perry from 1982 to 1994, many of which reflected Perry's fascination with ceramic traditions, none more so than the series of funerary urns inspired by Wedgwood's iconic black basalt vases, playfully turning reverence for neoclassical art on its head. And for anyone in the audience based in the UK or able to travel here, this exhibition has actually just opened at York Art Gallery and will travel to the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts in Norwich later this year. So having taken a minute to introduce myself, I'll now turn to the primary topic that I'll discuss this evening. My title, Wedgwoods Networks, A British Story, A Global Trade, reflects something you as international Wedgwood fans understand very well. Wedgwood is often understood to be a quintessentially British brand. As we know, from the 18th century onwards, the company expanded from its base in the heart of Staffordshire to become a global phenomenon. And today, Wedgwood's fans and collectors are a global community as well. At a time when COVID has disrupted our usual patterns, and we're navigating wider political changes, such as Brexit, I've been considering Wedgwoods Networks from two perspectives. First, the way that the company made use of an extraordinary range of materials and artistic sources brought from around the world to create their ceramics, creating networks of suppliers and consumers to disseminate these goods to a global audience. And secondly, the networks of people, collectors, designers, and thinkers, the influencers of the day, whose patronage and ideas shaped the brand we know and love. Josiah Wedgwood was part of a community of entrepreneurs who tapped into an exponentially expanding network of trade created by the Industrial Revolution. This is, of course, a huge topic. So for today's talk, I will share some of my ongoing research, looking in detail at two of Wedgwood's masterpieces and sharing some insights into the areas that we at the V&A Wedgwood Collection team are exploring through our various collections focused projects. Both these objects are, of course, very familiar, and I feel essential to understanding Wedgwood's global impact. The first, on the left, Wedgwood's medallion created in support of the abolition of the slave trade. And second, Wedgwood's recreation of the Portland vase in Jasper. Both these objects took place at a time when Josiah Wedgwood had found great professional success and his business was firmly established, but as an older man, was almost certainly starting to consider his legacy. Uniquely and recognisably by Wedgwood, both these objects are made from materials invented or refined by Josiah and his team of experimental chemists and talented artists. The Portland vase, so much so that it has been on the company's backstamp on and off since the 1870s. They clearly reflect an engagement with the global Enlightenment, which Wedgwood, as an aspirational, talented and intelligent man, but also a person raised in the nonconformist traditions, interested in enlightenment and the value of human endeavour, would pursue. A young Josiah Wedgwood witnessed Staffordshire becoming a major centre of ceramic production by the 1750s, reliant on a national network of suppliers and catering to the latest fashions. Though Josiah Wedgwood himself had attended school before training as a potter, he was not classically educated. Rather, he was embedded in a progressive Midlands tradition of industrial advancement and social change. Wedgwood was part of a group of forward-thinking industrialists, scientists and thinkers based in the Midlands, including Joseph Priestley, seen here in a mould from 1795, and Matthew Bolton, James Watt, and Wedgwood's close friend, the physician and poet Erasmus Darwin, who met to discuss the scientific and political issues of the day. This fascinating group of men travelled to their monthly meetings by the light of the moon, which allowed for safer travel and earned them their name, the Lunar Society. Reflecting their impact, it has been argued, a nation of Newtons and Lockes became a nation of Boltons and Watts. I think we can safely add Wedgwood to this list as well. As a fellow entrepreneurial businessman, like some of his lunar colleagues, Wedgwood embraced technical advancement as much as advancement in taste and fashion. His pots appealed as much to aristocratic tastemakers as to the growing middle classes. But even as Wedgwood was supplying the wealthy with an endless array of desirable goods for the interior, indeed, at the same time as he was developing his Portland Vars project, aiming to build a list of elite subscribers, Wedgwood became actively involved in the abolition movement. So how did Josiah Wedgwood become involved in this most important cause? We know from Gay Blake Roberts' work on the topic of the importance of Thomas Bentley's influence on Wedgwood's perspectives on this, as in so many other topics. Bentley's connections to Liverpool and his own position as a merchant were clearly important in his forming his own views. Bentley had travelled widely on the continent. He was actively involved in local Liverpool life, and particularly as a merchant based in one of the busiest slave ports in the UK, an unusually prominent supporter of the abolition. Just for context, in 1792, approximately 1 in 5 enslaved people journeyed across the Atlantic from the port of Liverpool. And Bentley's early engagement with the abolition theme was clearly a formative part of Wedgwood's own understanding of the topic. The Lunar Society had other connections with the abolitionist theme. One of the earliest poems on the topic, an abolitionist poem published by John Bicknell and Thomas Day called The Dying Negro, published in 1773, was an early propagandist piece. And as we know, Thomas Day himself was involved with the Lunar Society too. But as well as the connections through the Lunar Society and Bentley, even after Bentley's death in 1780, Wedgwood continued his own engagement with the topic, subscribing to every available pamphlet and ultimately joining the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1787. Public awareness of the issue was really gaining ground by this point. Writings such as the previously mentioned poem, but also public awareness of the inhumanity of aspects of the slave trade from instances such as the famous case of the Zong massacre, where more than 130 enslaved Africans were drowned by the crew of the British slave ship and then actually claimed as part of the insurance for the ship. This was widely criticised in the press as a turning point in the debate. But of course, Wedgwood's most important contribution, as well as engaging with the wider discourse, was the production of medallions combining the emblem of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade with the motto, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And on screen, you can see 2 rare early versions of the medallion, produced not in jasper as later versions were, but in the caneware body and mounted in a black basalt frame. These are slightly larger in size than the simpler medallion that Wedgwood would go on to produce in a range of colourways. We believe that thousands of the medallions were distributed by the early 1790s. And within the V&A Wedgwood Collection archives, there are a number of entries that may refer to the creation of the medallion. The Wedgwood oven books used to record what went into the kilns at Etruria have the following brief entries. In December 1787, John Massey made 13 dozen black seals of a wax blackamoor large. In April 1792, J. Steele made 14 dozen black slave cameos, 1 1/4 inch. In December 1792, there is a mention of 7 dozen black seal pyramids of a wax blackamoor large and 6 dozen black pyramid figures of a wax blackamoor large. You'll notice from the descriptions, and I should say that these are the only known entries in any of the oven books that relate to the medallions or could relate to the medallions. We actually wonder whether the references are related to pieces like this, the seals with obviously the pyramid shape. Here's an example from the British Museum of that form. But what that really tells us is that we don't have a huge amount of documentary evidence to tell us how many and when the different medallions were produced by Wedgwood. But much of what we do know about the story of the medallions can be pieced together from material held in the archives, snippets of Wedgwood's correspondence with prominent abolitionists, including Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce, and Alada Equiano. One of the most famous and evocative accounts of the medallions came from abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, who commented, "Some had them inlaid in gold on the lids of their snuff boxes. Of the ladies, several wore them as bracelets, and others had them fitted up in an ornamental manner as pins for their hair. A fashion which usually confines itself to worthless things was seen for once in the honourable office of promoting the cause of justice, humanity, and freedom." I've selected a few examples to show how the medallions were mounted and set, including in sometimes quite lavish settings, such as the ivory and cut steel example on the right. The medallion's role as a marketing tool and a fashionable accessory adds to the nuance of the object. Wedgwood was well aware that by supporting and championing international causes such as the abolition of slavery in the French Revolution at the same time as being styled potter to Her Majesty, he could appeal to new and wider markets. Wedgwood profited hugely from the trade he personally opposed, finding new markets in the West Indies for wares that were no longer the latest fashion in Europe, and the wealth of his individual clientele and wider industrialized economy. It has been argued that by taking a public stand on this issue, Wedgwood might well have risked his commercial operations, even as the abolition issue became increasingly mainstream. And certainly looking at contemporary press, it highlights how much in the minority Wedgwood's position really was at the time. Noting Wedgwood's commitment, Clarkson remarked of Wedgwood, he made his own manufactory contribute to this end, and that does seem fitting for an industrialist and a supporter of advancement. But given Wedgwood's commercial focus, it's revealing that these medallions were not for sale, but made for handing out at abolition society meetings in support of the cause. As noted, the medallions became something of a fashion accessory, as well as being a forerunner to the protest badge and made to influence changes in policy. In a letter of 1788, famed abolitionist Clarkson requests a supply of the medallions for distribution as, "Tomorrow I enter upon a tour through the southern counties of the kingdom on the subject of the slave trade. And as some of these will again have their uses, I should be extremely obliged to you to furnish me with as many as you can spare." And if only we knew quite how many were actually produced. But unfortunately, we can't point to that in the records. In a letter written to Wedgwood on 9th of January 1792, Clarkson, seemingly aware of Wedgwood's high profile and therefore the impact his position might have for the cause, wrote in support of a pamphlet compiled by William Fox in 1791 called "An Address to the People of Great Britain on the Propriety of Abstaining from West India Sugar and Rum," which Clarkson felt would encourage petitions in support of abolition. Clarkson also suggested Wedgwood assist with circulating the pamphlet as well. On the 18th of January 1792, Wedgwood replied to Clarkson with his suggestion of adding the emblem of the kneeling enslaved man and the motto, "Am I not a man and a brother," featured in his own medallions, to the pamphlet to add to its impact, and proposed to have a woodcut made at his own expense, as well as ordering 2,000 more pamphlets. And again, perhaps the quantity of pamphlets might give us a sense of quite how many medallions were produced. Again, we just don't know. Wedgwood also met and corresponded with William Wilberforce, the parliamentary leader for the cause of the abolition of slavery. And Wilberforce was ultimately responsible for the passing of the bill enforcing the gradual abolition of slavery. And we get the sense from Wilberforce and Wedgwood's correspondence of how seriously Wilberforce took Wedgwood's position. And he stated in one that he committed to giving Wedgwood's ideas, quote, "the full support in the House of Commons." Wilberforce was also a guest at Etruria Hall, and an entry in his journal dated 16th of November 1791 mentioned the Wedgwood family, calling them a fine, sensible, spirited family, intelligent and manly in behaviour. The material we hold related to Olaudah Equiano, a prominent Black abolitionist and writer, also merits further examination. A letter to Wedgwood requests his subscription to Equiano's book, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, also known as Gustavus Vassa and the African, which was published in 1789 and recounts his own abduction in Nigeria and sale into slavery, before many years later arriving in London as a free man. Equiano writes to Wedgwood for his support on a visit to Bristol, as he is concerned about being press-ganged and seeks protection. Wedgwood offered his assurances that should he be press-ganged, Wedgwood would act on his behalf, and particularly if he were in London, to make his way to the Wedgwood showrooms if he needed a place of safety. This correspondence is a really revealing insight into the challenges that being a prominent opposer of the status quo represented in the 18th century. And in addition to the medallion and the other ways that I've mentioned that Wedgwood found to support the cause, he also mentions in a letter of August 1791 from Clarkson to Wedgwood, Clarkson writes that he had secured shares in the Sierra Leone Company for Wedgwood, urging him to take 10 shares instead of the 8 he had originally intended to buy. And Wedgwood ultimately became a shareholder in the Sierra Leone Company, an organisation set up after the American War of Independence, which aimed to relocate formerly enslaved people back to Sierra Leone. Also in Wedgwood's network, through their mutual association with the Lunar Society, was of course Benjamin Franklin. And we know that Wedgwood sent a quantity, again, an unspecified quantity, unfortunately, of cameos to Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia with the note, "This will be an epoch before unknown to the world, and while relief is given to millions of our fellow creatures immediately, the object of it, the subject of freedom, will be more canvassed and better understood in the enlightened nations." Franklin wrote in thanks, "I am distributing your valuable present of cameos among my friends, in whose countenances I've seen such marks of being affected by contemplating the figure of the supplicant, which is admirably executed, that I'm persuaded it may have an effect equal to that of the best written pamphlet in procuring honour to those oppressed people." I think it's a really insightful comment from Benjamin Franklin, that recognizing that the imagery could almost be more powerful than any written piece of propaganda on the topic. Returning to the medallion itself, and importantly its iconography, a black man chained, kneeling and appealing for equality. As we've seen, Wedgwood was aware of the potential power of this motif, but I do think the imagery requires further interrogation. The kneeling figure has classical and Christian antecedents, but the specific motif has become entwined with Wedgwood's story. When searching for information about the medallion, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Josiah Wedgwood himself sketched out the drawing, as many sources seem to suggest this, not least the ever useful Wikipedia, which actually attributes the design to Wedgwood himself. But I should say that many, many other sources do attribute this as well. We know that the seal was commissioned by the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, as this is recorded in the minutes of their meeting on 5th of July 1787. Some sources suggest that Wedgwood combined imagery and slogan. Certainly he chose to mobilise his business to create and disseminate the medallion for free to promote the cause. But there is in fact no documentary evidence that Wedgwood or one of his designers actually designed the motif. The modelling of the design equally is frequently attributed to William Hackwood, but even Hackwood's role in translating the design into the Wedgwood cameo is in some ways conjecture, as it's likely based on a 20th century annotation on one of the earlier moulds. As Mary Guyot has convincingly argued, the imagery itself reflects a complex and in some ways contradictory 18th century viewpoint, both arguing for equality underpinned by Enlightenment principles and representing the Black enslaved man as a submissive, pleading, shackled and ultimately unthreatening figure. Those in support of the abolition of the slave trade recognised that for the image to do its work as a piece of propaganda, it needed to express their impassioned aims via a visual vocabulary that could be easily understood by a European audience. Gay Blake Roberts has argued that the medallion reflected Wedgwood's desire to make known the suffering of the slaves, for he believed that the knowledge of the evils of the slave trade would inspire universal detestation of its cruelty and conviction of its injustice. The motif was later reproduced and disseminated in many different contexts, not least by other ceramics factories, on snuff boxes, and there are examples in collections throughout the world. And I've particularly included one of the medal in the middle, which includes am I not a man and a brother on one side, and on the other side, whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. Variations on this theme, as I said, appeared in many different contexts. And for those of you who are interested in seeing how particularly other ceramics factories reinterpreted the motif, there's an article on just that topic in latest British Museum research publication by Ron Fuchs and Patricia Ferguson, which I highly recommend. The motif of the kneeling enslaved man also appears in an early version of that other image so often used to illustrate Britain's role in the abolition story, the diagram of the Brooks ship. Both the abolition medallion and the Brooks were about spreading a clear message in support of the abolition by highlighting the inhumanity of trade in humans. Yet it's important to remind ourselves both how radical the abolitionist movement was and that the abolition which we're talking about didn't actually mean the abolition of slavery, but the abolition of the slave trade, in the hope that by preventing any new enslavements, the ultimate goal of abolishing the practice entirely would surely follow. Indeed, although the key abolition date in Britain was 1807, it was not until 1833 that the emancipation of enslaved people occurred. So while the abolition of the slave trade would not happen in Wedgwood's own lifetime, members of his family would continue the fight and were prominent anti-Saccharites. So they boycotted sugar as recommended in the pamphlet I mentioned earlier, reflecting the interconnectedness of empire and global consumption. And as we've seen, 2020 saw a resurgence of interest in the iconic abolition medallion. And we, as an increasingly globalized and polarized global community, have grappled with issues of race and inequality following the murder of George Floyd. Yet polarization was also part of the discourse in the 18th century, and many vociferously opposed abolition. But lest we imagine that Wedgwood and other abolitionist views were unopposed, we have, a wide range of material in the collection that sort of contradicts that, including a letter from Josiah Wedgwood to Anna Seward, the poet, the Swan of Lichfield, reflecting on the slave trade and making the case. And as James Welvin has argued, the British suffered a prolonged bout of forgetfulness about their own entanglement with slavery and only recently seem to have emerged from this historical amnesia. The abolition movement generated a smokescreen behind which the British could hide their slaving past. Last year, we in the UK saw the statue of slaver Edward Colston torn down in Bristol, and there was a sense that the reputation of Stoke-on-Trent's man was safe. The spotlight fell on Wedgwood in contrast to Colston and was celebrated in local news stories. Josiah Wedgwood was rightly hailed as an unusual and prominent 18th century voice in the campaign for the abolition of slavery. But Wedgwood's medallions, as I said, have found a new audience. And for some of our audience, I wanted to just share with you the news that we're developing a very exciting project focused on the medallions, which aims to increase the prominence of the display and explore some of the contemporary responses to the object, considering how our actions and reactions to such an emotive object have changed as the world changes around us. And returning again to the imagery of the kneeling figure, even this week as the Euro 2020 soccer tournament kicks off, footballers kneeling during the national anthems to protest racial injustice are being booed. And their movement to kneel during the national anthem was, as I'm sure you may be aware, inspired by US football star Colin Kaepernick, who himself drew on a long tradition of non-violent protest going back to the civil rights movement. And of course, Kaepernick lost his star footballer status after his peaceful protest. And I think at a time when museums are increasingly thinking about what their objects really mean to audiences today, I think we have to accept that this current moment might make us look again at an object like the abolition medallion. So we're co-creating a project to examine and reinterpret the Wedgwood abolition medallion and to work with our communities to create a new medallion for the 21st century. And to do that, we're collaborating with anti-racism campaigner Grace Barrett, who's herself from Stoke-on-Trent, to deliver a workshop for school children to give students a hands-on experience of making, curating and designing over the course of a week. And the students will have the opportunity to gain a Bronze Arts Award qualification and work with us to redisplay the medallion. And we'll create a trail through the galleries working with our audiences and also showcase the project as part of the British Ceramics Biennial in Stoke-on-Trent this autumn. And we're also creating new digital resources, exploring the origins, dissemination and meaning of the Wedgwood medallion, which I hope will be of interest to you Wedgwood enthusiasts, as we'll be drawing out what we do and don't know about the precise history of the medallion. The project will shine a light on Wedgwood's extraordinary contribution to the abolitionist movement, reminding us that some of the fights that Wedgwood fought have yet to be won. So I'm now going to move on to the final part of my talk, which will introduce another project that we've been working on at the V&A Wedgwood Collection. While we know that useful wares were actually the linchpin of Wedgwood's commercial endeavours, it was in decorative vases that the self-appointed vase maker general to the universe would focus his efforts and cement his success, working in partnership with the erudite Bentley. And I've included 3 examples of very different styles of vases that we very much associate with Wedgwood. At the time, excuse me, at the time when Wedgwood and Bentley's ornamental partnership was taking off in Europe, porcelain was still the order of the day, representing the ultimate in desirability and fashion for the wealthy. I think we can all agree that Wedgwood's genius was in sufficiently refining and improving the wares of Staffordshire and making pottery, including his own invention jasper, as desirable and in some cases as expensive as porcelain, and marketing it as such. From his early success in gaining the attention of Queen Charlotte, Wedgwood relied on a network of high-profile supporters, the influencers of the day, from fashionable architects like Adam, Wyatt and Chambers, and members of the nobility, such as Sir William Hamilton and Sir Watkins Williams Wynne, whose collections provided further inspiration for Wedgwood's designs. And it's this aspect that this part of my talk will focus on. Wedgwood's elite networks themselves co-opted the classical world as British, and we see this perhaps most strongly in the case of the Portland Vase, because this is the project that would dominate Wedgwood's final years, creating a perfect copy of the Portland Vase in jasper. Wedgwood's ambition was to recreate one of the most famous survivals from ancient Rome, a glass cameo vessel also known as the Barbarini vase, thought to date from around AD 25. The Portland vase is so associated with Wedgwood that it's an interesting exercise to return to the real vase, if you will, and really compare the two. But it's also a testament to Josiah Wedgwood's dogged commitment to the project to look at the numerous trials involved in creating the vase, and that's what I'm going to do now. Given Wedgwood's success in he was familiar with the idea of recreating and potentially surpassing historical and especially classical designs. But for such an iconic object, it's really fascinating to consider just how enigmatic the decoration on the Portland vase really is. There are various different interpretations of the scenes, and the most likely one is that of the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, suggested by the appearance of Cupid, a marriage torch, and a sea snake. But we think of the vase in its sort of current form, and if you like, its Wedgwood form, but it's thought originally to have been an amphora shape with a rounded base, and perhaps adapted as a result of damage with a decorative base, which probably slightly later shows the Judgment of Paris, and that was the image that I included on my very first slide this evening. First discovered in the 16th century, the first mention of the vase is in the writings of French antiquary Nicolas Claude Fabry de Paris, who saw it in Rome during the winter of 1601 in the collection of Cardinal del Monte. The vase was believed to have been discovered in a sarcophagus, possibly that of the 3rd century Roman Emperor Alexander Severus and his mother. The vase later passed to the powerful Barbarini family of Rome, and by the end of the 17th century, it was one of the most important sites of Rome and a must-see on the Grand Tour. It was endlessly reproduced and illustrated in publications and would have been familiar to the classically educated. Among the best known reproductions featured in Bernard de Montfaucon's L'Antiquité expliquée, and we know Wedgwood was familiar with this version. The vase remained with the Barbarini family for more than 150 years until it was sold around 1780 by Donna Cordelia Barbarini Colonna, who was forced to sell off family heirlooms to pay her gambling debts. But for our story, that it was acquired by Sir William Hamilton, a great patron of Wedgwood, from James Byers, the Scottish dealer, between 1780 and 1783 is particularly important. In a letter dated 24th of July 1786, Hamilton described his reaction on first seeing the vase. The person I bought it of at Rome will do me the justice to say that the superior excellence of this exquisite masterpiece struck me so much at first sight that I eagerly asked, "Is it yours? Will you sell it?" He answered, "Yes, but never under £1,000. The vase probably came into Hamilton's hands in 1782, and he returned to England from Naples in August 1783 with it in his possession. Hamilton ultimately sold the vase to Margaret Cavendish Benting, the Duchess of Portland, cuttingly described by Horace Walpole as a simple woman but perfectly sober and intoxicated only by empty vases, which I think is somewhat unfair to one of the major collectors of antiquities of the 18th century. The Duchess purchased the vase in January 1784 in secrecy along with a group of antiquities. In March 1784, Without disclosing its true ownership, Hamilton showed the vase to the Society of Antiquaries, of which he was a fellow. And at that stage, he'd already arranged for another artist, G.B. Cipriani, to borrow the vase in order to make drawings from it. So the Duchess only had a short time in which to enjoy her purchase, as she died in July 1785. The sale of her collection, of which you can see the frontispiece of the catalogue on the left, ran for 6 weeks from 24th of April 1786, and the vase was listed as the penultimate item of the last day. It was ultimately purchased by her son, the third Duke of Portland, and Wedgwood's single-mindedness saw him write to the Duke days after the sale requesting to borrow the original vase so he could copy it. On the 10th of June 1786, he signed a receipt for the vase. So what do we know about the period from 1786 to 1790 when Josiah undertook the extraordinary process of recreating the vase in jasper? And where did this extraordinary idea to create the vase in jasper come from? It was almost certainly John Flaxman Jr. who drew Wedgwood's attention to the vase, writing to him in February 1785, "I wish you may soon come to town to see William Hamilton's vase. It is the finest production of art that has been brought to England and seems to be the very apex of perfection to which you are endeavouring to bring your bisque and jasper. It is made of dark glass with white enamel figures. The vase is about 1 foot high and the figures between 5 and 6 inches, engraved in the same manner as a cameo and of the grandest and most perfect Greek sculpture." I think you get the sense from Flaxman's letter of somebody who has very much seen the process of artistic recreation from start to finish. The technical details really come through from his letter as well as the artistic ones. Josiah Wedgwood had written to Sir William Hamilton quite early on about his intentions to create a copy. I showed you the letter on screen a few slides ago, but Josiah wrote, "You will be pleased, I'm sure, to hear what a treasure is just now put into my hands. I mean the exquisite Barbarini vase with which you enrich this island, and which now we may call the Portland vase." Wedgwood was not the first to take an impression of the vase, though. The vase's owner before Hamilton bought it in 1783 was, as I mentioned, James Vars, an entrepreneurial Scottish architect living in Rome, who'd purchased it in the early 1780s. On Vars's order, the gem engraver Giovanni or Johannes Pichler made an exact mould of the vase, which was then sent to the eminent Scottish modeller James Tassie, who at the time was living in London, with instructions to produce about 60 casts in plaster and then to destroy the mould. And here you can see 2 casts or moulds of the Portland vase on screen. The one on the right is thought possibly to be one of Tassie's models because it has the same distinctive dark brown coloured finish. And on the left is the cast taken in the Wedgwood factory. As we will see, this process of casting the vase was to capture the detail of each element of the decoration. We also hold a mould taken from the original glass vase in the collection, showing the elaborate division in parts for this complicated piece. And here you can see an image of the old Wedgwood Museum in one of its early locations. And I've just circled there that you can actually see that that mould is part of the original museum display. So it was obviously seen to be quite an important thing. I should say it's a side view, so you might not be able to tell that it is the mould, but I promise you it is if you look closely. The next few slides will give you a real sense, I hope, of the extraordinary endeavours that Wedgwood and his team undertook to recreate the Portland vase in jasper. Wedgwood put several of his top modellers, including Henry Webber, William Hackwood and William Wood, to work on the vase, supervising the modelling himself. So he was obviously extremely invested in the outcome of this experimental process. What really strikes you comparing the original Barbarini vase with Wedgwood's copy is how glassy the glass really is. That may seem like a simple thing to say, but when you look at the trials that Wedgwood created, you really see him experimenting with ways of making the decoration have that sort of sparkling translucency that really comes from the glass. And so the next time that you see a Portland vase up close, I really urge you to look for that translucency that really isn't there when you first look, but the more you look, the more you realize the layers and depths of complexity that the Wedgwood modelers, molders and skilled craftspeople brought to the rolls. So the one of the other aspects that we see in the collection trials is that there are multiple stages involved in every aspect of ceramic production. And the other challenge, of course, that the molders were dealing with was the fact that the casts of the real vase had to be scaled up and down in order to have the clay fire to the right scale in order to create an exact copy. So the technical skill involved in all these stages is really just phenomenal. I have another example, just picking out one tiny detail, which again gives, I think, an insight into the complexity, the number of tests that the team at Wedgwood undertook to recreate each individual motif to the exact right level and degree of perfection. And I think here I'm not sure if I can do a pointer actually, but if I can, then I'm pointing at this one in the bottom in the middle, which is has got some real sort of firing issues in the kiln. And if you can imagine that at the time when Wedgwood was creating these trials, they'd really mastered the art of ceramic production, and so to be still having kind of quite obvious technical challenges really shows and highlights the difficulty of what they were undertaking. And just finally, I've included the Cupid motif, again showing how they created molds from the casts of the original vase and then tried them out on all sorts of different backgrounds. And the central motifs that you can see in the middle here also highlight the experiment with the jasper color too. Again, we think of the finished vase as quite sort of almost black, but actually the more you look, you realize it's a very sort of dark, rich blue, really close to the original Barbarini vase color. And I wanted to show this motif because it links really back to Wedgwood's own writing about the process of recreating the vase. Wedgwood's commonplace books have many mentions of the Portland vase and its development, and there are some particularly harsh or self-critical comments from April and May 1790 when Wedgwood compared the original vase with his copy. For instance, he writes about the figure of Cupid, whom you can see on screen, that his left thigh is much too shaded, his position is too perpendicular, the size of his wings is not quite right. And this indicates that even by 1790, when Wedgwood had actually finished his perfect copy of the Portland vase, he's still trying to recreate the perfect copy of the vase. And there's also in the commonplace book a really interesting tussle with the vase's design, because a perfect copy of the Portland vase must by its very nature be imperfect, because the vase itself isn't straight. The vase itself has flaws and kind of visual imperfections, and so it's very interesting trying to unpick a sort of consummate artist's approach to what perfection really means in this context. But Sir Joshua Reynolds, then president of the Royal Academy, certified that Wedgwood's version was a correct and faithful imitation, both in regard to general effect and the most minute detail of the parts. So, I mean, I think that's a pretty good endorsement, but still, I think this image really shows just a snapshot of some of the trials that we have in the collection. It really, there really are so many, and I think it highlights that point that I mentioned about creating and recreating and the pursuit of perfection. And the one that I've included larger on the right here is quite interesting, because you see two different and separate motifs from the Portland vase on the same piece, which really emphasizes that these really were trials. They were not for sale. They were not miniature sections of the Portland vase picked out for wider dissemination. They really are the ceramicists experimenting, testing and trying out the very complex process of creating the vase. So I also wanted to share these fantastic full-size trials, which are on show in the museum. I must admit that I find them some of the most sort of evocative objects in the collection for some reason, because somehow when you see the absolute refinement of the perfect version of the Portland vase, you can almost take it for granted. Whereas when you see what really can go wrong in the kiln and how skilled every element of the process really needs to be. So this slightly sort of, sort of somewhat unappealing bubbling surface on one of the full-size versions really highlights that. And the fact that this was actually retained in the museum as well is a kind of interesting insight into the experimental process that Josiah undertook. And of course, as we know, he designed the pyrometer in the early 1780s to make the process of measuring temperatures in the kiln that much easier to do. And even still, they had issues like this coming from kiln temperatures. And this second full-size trial shows an entirely different kind of issue. Here, the issue is with the white jasper sort of cameo decoration just refusing to stick to the black jasper surface and causing all sorts of issues. So after all that experimentation and re-experimentation and pursuit of perfection, finally in September 1789, Josiah sent a successful copy of the vase to Erasmus Darwin, which is now in the Fitzwilliam Museum. And Darwin went on to include a description of the vase with an illustration by William Blake in his poem, his epic poem, The Botanic Garden. But even at this stage, having completed what we would consider the perfect version of the Portland vase, even imperfectly sort of sorry, I'm not quite straight, just like the original Barbarini vase is. Josiah was still concerned about how to prevent unauthorized copies from being made, and in fact there's again quite a lot we don't know about these first edition vases. So the exact number of first edition vases is also not known. Aileen Dawson, of course, gives a very detailed log with the best estimate of 45 first editions, of which 31 were best quality. Some of the black jasper first editions were numbered with manganese pencil inside the lip. And there are also various other iterations of the vase because, of course, Wedgwood kept making it. So there are blue Portland vases produced when the Barbarini black clay temporarily ran out in 1791, including one at the British Museum, which was presented by Josiah II. And through the 19th century, various iterations of the vase were made, including versions in different clay bodies, such as white stoneware, Curator, and at one stage 6 different sizes ranging from 4 to 6 inches were in production. There were also cast versions and still others with drapery added to conceal the nude figures. And the vase was also produced in multiple colours. All the vases appear to be of solid jasper colour, but actually most were made by the jasper dip method, using a coarse body washed with a finer slip to create that perfect smooth finish. So following this lengthy and costly project to recreate the vase, drumming up interest in the vase and consequently sales was a particularly important part of the process for the Wedgwoods. Josiah II, who had been involved in production and also later the dissemination of the vase, toured the European courts with Thomas Byerley, setting off to Holland at the end of May 1790 to show off this masterpiece. The 18th century was really an era of blockbuster exhibitions, and Wedgwood absolutely understood the potential of creating a sort of media moment, as it were, ever aware of marketing opportunities, and in the same vein as he had done for the Frog Service exhibition in the 1770s. So Queen Charlotte viewed the vase in London at the beginning of May 1790, and it was later displayed to a distinguished gathering at Sir Joseph Banks's house on the 5th of May 1790. Wedgwood opted for a subscription model to sell the vase and had sold 20 subscriptions by 9th of May 1790. And on the left, you can actually see the original subscription list, which includes such luminaries as, well, I could read you the whole lot, but I'm not sure we want to listen to that. But actually, there's a really interesting range, and actually I think there's something that we'd really like to look into, is to discover a bit more about who those original subscribers were and perhaps how they came to be part of this story. So you might wonder why we are revisiting this kind of most famous of Wedgwood stories at the moment, and the reason for that is that we've just started a really exciting project to 3D scan the Portland vase and all of Wedgwood's trials in collaboration with Staffordshire University. And so here on screen, you can see some of the skilled technicians from Staffordshire University using different scanning techniques to capture different aspects of the objects. The examples that I've chosen to show you are of the full-size vases, and you can sort of see how they're captured, both the models and the vases themselves, through the 3D process. And the aim of this project is really to examine Wedgwood's idea of perfection, because by looking at the differences between the trials, the molds, the casts, of course, of the original and the finished product, we'll really be able to see these objects in a way that isn't really possible, and will, I think, have a better understanding, and I think probably be even more in awe of the extraordinary skills of Wedgwood's amazing craftspeople. So through this process, we've used three different scanning techniques, including photogrammetry, macro scanning, and sort of handheld laser scanning, to be able to examine every surface in a detail that's really surprisingly revealing. And you might think that, you know, in our age of sort of digital everything, we don't need any more digital recreations, but actually the process reveals fingerprints. It reveals a level of extraordinary depth of knowledge about the objects that we just can't see with the naked eye. And we hope that by making some of the scans available once we finish the process, that people will even be able to 3D print their own Portland vase, should they wish. But actually we'll be able to share the extraordinary skill involved in creating these objects in a way that just hasn't been possible in the past. And so I'm really pleased to just show you a few of the scans in progress, because this is very much an ongoing project. And perhaps we might encourage some other collections or museums to scan their own Wedgwood wares as well. Here is just a view of the vase, and I should say that they are a work in progress, and I'm very grateful to Professor Neil Brownsword and Staffordshire University for letting me include these images this evening. Here are some of the scans of the, on the right is one of the molds, the casts, and on the left is, you might be able to recognize that very distinct bubbling surface on the left of one of the full-size trial vases. And here the scans of the cast, the mold of the cast, and so we'll be able to piece that together digitally, and I think have all sorts of fun and creative work coming out of that. So I wanted to just show a final image really of, I suppose in defense of both new and old technology, because 3D scanning is something that really opens up different perspectives, but it is also really humbling and amazing to be able to watch the skill of people working with clay in ways that are so similar to how things would have been done in the 18th century. And here you can see the fantastic team from Wedgwood. Chris Mottram here is throwing a full-size vase, and you can see on the table as well his model to help him, to guide him to get it to be the right size. And yeah, it's just amazing to be able to see that process still happening in the factory today. I wanted to end with a slightly amusing cartoon, well, it made me laugh anyway, of Josiah V dressed as a schoolboy. And this is from the Wedgwood Review in 1961. The sort of ongoing joke of which version of the Portland vase is the real version. And I also wanted to include that in that same edition of the Wedgwood Review, there's a quote from the Evening Standard on the 13th of July. Overheard in the British Museum, voice amid hushed group contemplating the Portland vase. But mummy, it's not Wedgwood, says the little child. And I'm really grateful to Rebecca for pointing that one out to me, because I think without her and Lucy, I must particularly thank for helping me with so many of the images for my talk and so many of the snippets and wonderful stories that feed into these sort of classic Wedgwood tales. This is my final slide, and I just wanted to include it because I just think it's the most charming image, but also highlighting the fact that the Portland vase is just so interconnected with Wedgwood's story. And so even if we think we might know everything about it, I think there's always more to uncover. So I did say that I would finish by just sharing very briefly some of our plans for the V&A Wedgwood Collection. And so I'll do that now. Well, the first thing I wanted to say is that I'm sure many of you know us as the Wedgwood Museum, and indeed some of you may always think of us as the Wedgwood Museum, and that remains a really important part of our history. But we have, as you might have spotted, recently changed our name to the V&A Wedgwood Collection, which reflects the fact that we are a part of the Victoria and Albert Museum's wonderful collections, but we are a distinct part. As we catalogue our collections, you'll notice that all the museum numbers for the Wedgwood collection have a WE for Wedgwood, and our online records and material will indicate whether collections are a part of the V&A's main collections in South Kensington or on show in the fantastic museum in Barlaston. We're developing projects with other parts of the V&A, including V&A Dundee, Museum of Childhood, and V&A East, the new project in East London. But we are firmly rooted in Stoke-on-Trent. And our small team is, when COVID permits us to, in the offices in Stoke-on-Trent and developing all of our projects there. But we've used a lot of the time in lockdown to really plan for our future. So over the coming years, major cataloguing and storage projects will mean that the whole collection will be available online for the first time. And a first step towards this for you digital fans has been to launch our new V&A Wedgwood Collection social media accounts, which are run by the curatorial team, to share stories and objects from the museum. And as we continue to develop content, we're looking forward to hearing from the WIS community of specialists and collectors and learning from your expertise, as well as sharing what we're learning. Research is going to be a really important part of what we do. And last month you heard the fantastic news from Rebecca Klarner that we've been successful in securing funding for her PhD project, which will shed light on the extraordinary 20th century collections we hold and celebrate the artistic and creative links with the RCA and many others. I'm also really delighted to announce that in 2022, we'll be hosting a symposium in honour of Gay Blake Roberts to examine the current state of Wedgwood research. And this has been somewhat delayed for COVID reasons, but you will hear more from us on that in the coming months. In addition, I'm also currently working on a new introduction to Wedgwood as part of the V&A's Artist in Focus series. This is going to be a new book published by Thames and Hudson, which will draw on the extraordinary range of the V&A Wedgwood collections from the 18th century to the modern day. So in a sense, it's the story that the museum tells, but in brief. Finally, if you've enjoyed hearing about the Portland Vars story that I've been telling you today, that story will actually feature in the forthcoming second season of the BBC documentary Secrets of the Museum, which will air later this summer on BBC. So, as well as giving you a bit of an insight into some of our ongoing research and projects, I hope that today has given you a sense of the direction of travel for Wedgwood and something of what the future holds. And I really look forward to the discussion and, of course, to having the opportunity to meet many of you when we're able to travel overseas once again. So thank you so much for listening, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Katrin. That was really fascinating. So we do have a question in the chat. Hold on just a moment and I'll pull it up. The question, Katrin, is where did Josiah Wedgwood stand on the use of child labor in the potteries?
That's a really interesting question. And I think we know that Wedgwood was very involved in the abolition story, but perhaps less so in some aspects of worker stories. And I think that's something that I know that Brian Dolan and others have written quite extensively about Wedgwood's particular work, approach to work. I think Wedgwood obviously took it very seriously to have a nice environment for his workers, but I think across the industry we find that there are things that perhaps today we might look on with, I think it's fair to say, horror. So I think it's certainly something that we could look more into, and I think that that there were certainly many examples of children working in roles that we just simply would find extraordinary today.
Another question has come in. Did you say that there's a new book on the slave medallion? And could you please repeat that information?
So I mentioned an article by Ron Fuchs and Patricia Ferguson, which has been published in the newest British Museum research publication, which is called I think it's called Pots, Prints and Politics, or Prints, Pots and Politics, one after the other. And it's a series of articles and essays about all sorts of different ceramic themes. And there's a really interesting article in that. But I think there are actually quite a few interesting publications coming out. And actually one of the things that we'll be doing as part of the project is producing a really extensive online bibliography, which will be accessible to all, about the medallion. And so we'll pull together all these links. We're working on that at the moment, so it'll be a few months before it'll be publicly available, but it's going to be a very comprehensive list of every possible source that that we can find about this theme.
Great. Here's another question. Thank you all for asking questions. Any comments on Wedgwood's impressions of Roman art? There are many Roman cameo glass pieces in this technique, as well as ceramics with cameo figures, some of which were likely excavated in England from the Roman occupation.
So I don't know how much he knew about art discovered. Do you mean in Roman artifacts discovered in Britain, or did I misunderstand the question? But
I think that's what's meant.
Yeah,
I think that's what's meant.
So no, that's a really interesting question. I must say, I don't know the answer to that specific aspect, but I think it's very interesting to see the range of different stories and themes that come through in those extraordinarily detailed Jasper reproductions. I mean, I think it's clear that Wedgwood was very literate in all of the different, all the vernacular of Roman art, because they reproduce so many classical motifs in on vases, in cameos, in intaglios, small scale, large scale. I think there's a kind of real familiarity and skill with that language, that visual language that comes through in Wedgwood. So, I mean, I think the answer to that is yes, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Katrin. And that's our last question in the chat. And I just wanted to quickly open up. Does anyone have any remaining questions? We can take a live question. Don't forget to unmute yourself. And if not, we'll turn it over to Lorraine again.
Okay, thank you. So just to sum up some of the housekeeping that I started out with, I'd like to say, please remember to be on the lookout for an email that'll be coming in the next few weeks, which will give you a link for an evaluation questionnaire about our Zoom lecture series. And please don't forget to also look periodically at the WIS Facebook page, because I continually try to update that with new projects that Wedgwood is doing, Zoom lectures sponsored by other ceramics groups, and just plain Wedgwood in the news. Again, I'd like to remind you that if you are not a member and these lectures were pleasing to you and you learned something, and I'm sure you did from every one of them, you might want to get a membership form from our website, wedgwoodinternationalseminar.org, and just access that link and please join. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to please thank Katrin for all of the work and time and effort into this wonderful lecture that you just delivered. And certainly not more important, but very important, because this is the fifth and last lecture of this series, I want to give a really, one of these big round of applause to the team. I didn't do this by myself. Thank you to Ellis Rubin. Thank you to Anne. And thank you to David, who you can't see, but believe me, if we didn't have David behind the scenes, we'd have a computer problem. So thank you to the team. Thank you for coming. And when we get more information, maybe we can see you all again in the fall. Have a nice summer, everybody.